thank you. As I said, I'm Sandie Bateman, Director of Learning and Development for SHRM Group. And our panelists today will be Ronnie Grabon, Lacy DeBerry, and Renee Martin. So our format for this will be to give each of the panelists an opportunity to speak. And we're focusing on DE&I initiatives, moving from the initial initiative to accountability. And we've had several questions that ask, what does accountability look like? So I hope we will answer that. We're going to start off today with Lacy DeBerry, and he's going to talk a little bit about the strategic initiative itself, recognizing unconscious bias in recruiting, interviewing, and employee engagement. As I said, it'll be about 5 minutes for his part and then about 10 minutes of Q&A. So here's Lacy. I'll let him tell you a little bit about himself.
Thank you, Sandie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lacy DeBerry. I work for local government, have done so in human resources for the past 13 and a half years, among other things, as well as working with SHRM-SCP Group. Glad to be here today. Hopefully we will present some information that is critical in your decision-making and helpful. We strongly believe in DEI initiatives. We know it works, and we're living examples of that. So that being said, I'm going to give you a broad-based format, and then my colleagues will narrow the focus down to address those issues as far as equity and other concerns. So let's start with the basic premise of what is diversity in the workplace. And diversity, workplace diversity in and of itself is understanding, accepting, and valuing differences between people that include races, ethnicities, genders, ages, religion, disabilities, and sexual orientation, as well as in their education, personality, skill sets, experiences, and knowledge bases. All right. Inclusion in the workplace is the collaborative, supportive, and respectful environment that increases the participation and contribution of all employees. As a matter of fact, with inclusion, there comes the removal of all barriers. And this information I'm drawing from comes from an article in Ideal for HR professionals. What is diversity and inclusion? Okay, well, diversity and inclusion is a company's mission, strategies, and practices to support a diverse workplace and leverage the effects of diversity to achieve a competitive business advantage. I think there's a quote that I'd like to refer to when it comes to diversity, and that's companies that embrace diversity and inclusion in all aspects of their business statistically outperform their peers. And that's by Josh Burson. All right. This information was collected as a result of a survey that was done by Forbes. And that included 300 senior executives, 32% were in my field of HR and talent management. And this is what they found out as far as companies' diversity and inclusion priorities, to include that 65% said diversity is important as far as recruitment was concerned. 44% said retention of diverse talent was critical. 35% said diversity was interested in ensuring diversity in the workplace. 29% said developing a robust pipeline of diverse talent was critical for the development of that company. And 28% said managing cross-generational issues was highly important. As we move on to the next slide, let's look at some of the strategies. And I understand that you wanted to know what were their accountability issues or concerns, and some of this will be addressed. It needs to first and foremost be endorsed by your chief executive officer or your chief operating officer or your CHRO. That needs to be a statement that simply says we support diverse efforts and we encourage that on all levels, and also that speaks to accountability. So that's starting to hold those direct reports accountable for their efforts, as well as serve as incentives to change the behaviors, to hold your leaders accountable, and to reward those efforts where diversity takes place. By and large, when we talk about unconscious bias and other issues that people aren't aware of, development or training your people on all levels from top to bottom is critical so that they become aware of how they show up during the recruitment process, during the development or training process, as well as in promotional opportunities. So the more self-awareness your company becomes, your employees, your executives become, the more they're able to identify this may create barriers or prevent us from actually achieving our goals. There is a buy-in to integrate diversity and inclusion strategies. What it should not be is a set aside, but it should be incorporated in all areas: recruitment, performance management, leadership assessment, training, and so on and so forth. Other strategies would include, as you can see listed here, employee resource groups. It could be rewards to honor and respect the goals of, here's what we set out to do in the course of this fiscal year, and this is how we measure ourselves, and this is the rewards that we can see. So you also want to create a presence in your corporate community or in your community that says, not only do we value diversity and inclusion efforts, here's how we stack up against other organizations. Next slide, please. Now, some of the best practices, these were also listed from a survey of 330 HR executives. And look at what comes up as number one. Above all, fair treatment of all employees, as well as equal access to opportunities for all employees. So as you can see, you'll start to see a common thread there is, what is it that we can do to enforce what is existing, but also as we start to expand, what would that look like? Are we using our best talent? Are we being innovative? Are we reaching out? Are we looking at people that we typically underserved populations, and what could we do to entice them, to recruit them, and to retain them? Okay, as well as being able to show we model that diversity, we model that equity and inclusion in our organization. And again, to underscore, training is paramount in terms of helping us to prepare in the future, as well as things come about. Next slide, please. Oh, I think that's, and some quick takeaways that you can, if you're an organization that's already incorporating DEI efforts, here's some things that you can look at in terms of measuring and seeing, well, where do we actually stack up? How is our mission statement? What strategies and practices have we implemented to support a diverse workplace? And how are we leveraging that to achieve a competitive business edge? What's our number one priority? Is it recruitment of diverse employees, among other things? Now, 50% of DEI's best practices aren't necessarily related to diversity, if you'll remember the previous slide, but practices desired by everyone, such as fair treatment and flexibility. We also want to focus on the outcomes. For success, again, this has to be endorsed from the CEO to the entry-level employee. Everyone needs to be speaking the same language when it comes to DEI efforts. When we look at measuring our success, what are we looking at? What are the metrics that we're looking at? One of the measures could be our productivity and our turnover. Why are people leaving? Why are they not high performing? These are questions that we can simply ask, and feedback helps us to formulate our new strategies. What do we need to tweak? As well as our decision-making seems to be diverse, that we're looking at it. We're looking at, if we've got a diverse team, we'll outperform others 87% of the time. And that DEI is in our forefront. I know it seems to be a trending subject, but it's here to stay. I'm here to reiterate that. And last but not least, your organization is diverse, you will outperform your competitors by 35%. And I'll stop there. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Lacy. I will remind you that you may indicate to Megan that you'd like to be unmuted so you can ask your question, or post your question in the chat box, and we will, either I will see it or Megan will see it, and we'll make sure we address it.
Thank you, Sandie.
We do have a question in the Q&A as well. Perhaps that it's one that you will get to a little bit later, but we have one that says, we recently struggled with how to address the more recent violence against Asian Americans. How do you decide when to address an issue publicly?
I would think the initial response is to reiterate your policy. reiterate your mission statement, is that that type of behavior is unacceptable, that you take it seriously as an organization, and that there is no tolerance for said behavior. That at least shows your corporate stance, but also for an individual is to begin to investigate and look at what precipitated that and what could we do to prevent that type of behavior, which could lead to more development. And actually, unfortunately, sometimes it'll lead to corrective action because we want to send a message. Again, this is what the expectations are for employees, for vendors, for customers, and here's how we address those issues.
Lacy, do you have any thoughts about the DEI initiative in the rural community with a large percentage of white population? How they might encourage a focus around diversity and inclusion?
I think just asking that question indicates a level of concern or at least curiosity. How do we match up against? Now, bear in mind, urban versus rural is also a form of diversity and looking at, well, what are the needs there? So is it cross-cultural? Is it more than just race or gender? Does it also include economic factors? So these are some of the questions in just polling your community leaders. What's important to you and how can we educate you on these specific issues so that you're trending with the rest of the country, your state, or your town or city?
Great. So as we move on, I'll invite others on the panel to speak to that when we do get to that particular session. So Katie Herco says, organization made a public anti-racism statement last year and created a corresponding DEI action plan. Says we recently struggled with how to address the more recent violence against Asian Americans. How do you decide? And that's when you to go publicly. And I think you did address that in your recent statement. So I may have duplicated there. Any others, Megan, that you see or that others would like to unmute and ask?
Yes, this one's a little bit of a statement, and it says, we have trouble getting people to engage in a conversation because people here don't think it applies to us, i.e. rural and white.
Okay. Well, I hear what they're saying, but this is a global concern. If you'll remember some of the protests and some of the events that took place last summer, one of the questions, and I'll use our organization as an example, that came out is, I'm white. How can I support this effort? What can I do? And the response was, listen, ask questions, engage in conversations. These are often uncomfortable and they can be frustrating, I must admit, but they're necessary in order to move the needle. So even though it doesn't seem like I'm living in an area that it's not really diverse racially, but at some point in time that could change. How can I support or become an ally to those that are facing different challenges, different from my geographical, different from racial, gender, and other efforts?
And Lacy, I'll go back to your initial comment where you talked about it's more than color. It's also diversity of thought. And, you know, one of the biggest diverse things that we see now is political affiliation and feelings around politics in the government. And certainly there's a lot of variation in feeling and a lot of sensitivity in that area now.
If I could, prior to this, I was listening to the president's press conference. And of course, one of the subjects that he talked about was immigration. Well, that affects everybody. You know, no matter what your geographical location is, we're all impacted by that. So as a society, what should we be doing? And I think that's the basic premise that we begin with. And how can we be more proactive? Because these aren't new problems or new issues. They've been with us for a number of years. How can we resolve them? How can we manage them better?
All right. So if we have no other questions on that topic, we'll move on and we'll hear from Renee. Renee
Great,
Martin's
thank you.
going to talk about gender and racial inequity and compensation, and I'll let her tell you a little bit about herself.
Great, thank you so much, Lacy and Sandie. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Am I on mute? Okay.
Yeah, you're fine.
Thank you. Okay. So my name is Renee Martin, and I'm a senior compensation consultant with SHRM-SCP Group. I help to support nonprofit clients in building and maintaining their compensation strategies. I've been an HR practitioner for about 20 years within nonprofits, universities, and for-profit corporations as well. And I'm pleased to share with you today about the important topic of pay equity. So to uncover gender and racial inequity in compensation, there are a few problems that we really need to understand. First of all, women in the US are still earning just 82 cents on the dollar compared to their male counterparts. Now, this gap does vary based on race and ethnicity, but it's worse for women of color in all cases and comes in at a staggering 54 cents on the dollar for Latina women. What this means over a lifetime, the gap results in an estimated $1.2 million of lost wages for a college graduate. So that's what it looks like across the lifespan. And whether it impacts our families, us individually, it certainly impacts our families and our communities for all of us. So despite the awareness and efforts to address the issue, racial and ethnic wage gaps unfortunately have widened over the past decade, even after factoring in educational differences. The remaining gap is caused predominantly by underrepresentation within higher paying jobs and industries. So women and minorities are less represented in those higher paying positions and industries. Compounding the issue, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disproportionately impacted women for a few reasons. First of all, the industries where women's employment is more concentrated have been hit harder, and there's less remote work options available for the jobs held predominantly by women. Secondly, as you can imagine, with school closures and daycare closures around the country, it makes it harder for parents to keep working in general. And this is especially true for mothers who tend to provide the majority of that childcare. Some of the legal requirements that we want to be aware of, certainly the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Interestingly, at that point in time, women were earning roughly 59 cents on the dollar compared to men in similar positions. So that you can see that we have made progress, but we still have work to do. It's projected by the Institute for Women's Policy Research that the pay gap will not be closed until 2059 at the pace that we are moving. So I think that's important to understand the history of that. And lastly, on this slide, I want to touch on the damages that can be done when allegations of pay discrimination occur. So defending a pay equity claim is also often expensive, and regardless of the outcome of the claim, the allegation of pay discrimination alone can really negatively impact the employer's brand, their reputation, their recruitment efforts, PR efforts, and certainly the organization's bottom line, whether that's for-profit or nonprofit. So the real cost of pay inequity is often evidenced in lost productivity, lost innovation, attrition, low staff morale, things like that, and retention issues as well. So we've made progress, but we still have a lot of work to do. So what can we do about it? First of all, I'll just say before you begin churning reports and analyzing the data and, working to close those gaps. You do want to make sure that you're protecting your organization just by establishing legal privilege, which will protect you from information that you uncover. So you'll want to speak to your counsel, internal or external counsel, before you begin, just to establish appropriate measures for your organization. Best practices really are to review your salaries annually. You're going to group your employees based on substantially similar work. So for example, if you have a grade structure in place, you can group employees by grade. If you don't have a grade structure in place, you can certainly group positions together that have a similar external and internal value to the organization. So in the nonprofit world, we're often looking at base pay for each of your incumbents. And you're going to, once you have your employees grouped, you'll be able to review the average pay for men within a group versus the average pay for women in that same group. This is going to give you your raw pay gap, and you're generally utilizing your white male data set as the baseline here. There are, in fact, some potentially acceptable reasons for differences in pay. We know that we pay differently based on a person's education, experience, performance, tenure, things like this. The caveat that I would want to point out is to make sure that we're looking beyond the surface at potentially acceptable factors to make sure that there is no innate bias. What I mean by that is really understanding the root causes so that the systemic pay gaps can be addressed rather than addressing only the symptoms. So for example, if you found that high performers within a group are paid higher, as you would imagine they should be, this on the surface is very appropriate. If strong performance in your organization, though, is determined by the number of evening and weekend fundraising events that someone attends, this could certainly disclude some of your workforce. So you would want to be careful in using that as a performance measure. So I think some of the lessons learned from COVID certainly could be that the work that we thought couldn't be done remotely has opened doors to find out that they really can be done remotely. So I think this is one thing to consider. And that certainly is a way to expand the diversity of your workforce. Also relative to performance, it should set us apart as a differentiator in compensation. One of the caveats that I would just raise is that studies have shown that the open boxes on performance reviews do have an implicit bias toward men. So for example, female employees are much more likely to receive vague feedback about their communication skills, where men are more likely to receive feedback regarding technical skills. So it just may mean that you want to tighten up your performance metrics so that it's very clear how people are being evaluated. And you want to make sure that you're measuring the right thing so that the reasons for pay differences are fair and are defensible. So in summary, the analysis process, you're really starting with raw data, noting where there are acceptable differences in pay or acceptable factors that could cause pay differences, and then examining those actual factors to understand if there is any implicit bias within those factors.
Thank you, Renee. So I see we've got a question.
With that,
yeah, we've got a question from Stacy Marshall. And Stacy, your first question that Lacy and I have seen, Ronnie will be specifically talking about this concept of top down versus bottom up in terms of buy-in. Renee, Stacy does have a question, however, about dealing with pay equity issues. And she said, most of your focus seems to be from top down. How would you also look at this from bottom up and perhaps build awareness and make initiative changes?
Absolutely. So I think from bottom up, it's important that the organization is sharing with employees that they are reviewing pay for equity purposes. They take it very seriously. They certainly can be sharing their policies within the organization. And then as an employee, really, I think it's, if I'm understanding the question of bottom up, it's being able to address, for employees to be able to address with their manager if they think that they are not being paid fairly. And I think that's an important conversation to have, because if that is, if an employee has that belief, you do want to make sure that they have a safe place to talk that through with their manager or with the HR department, someone that can really, help to provide clarity for them.
Megan, I see that Karen would like
Yes.
to ask a question.
Yes, so I'm going to open it up for Karen to speak. Bear with me. Karen, whenever you're ready, feel free to go for it. Be sure to unmute yourself, Karen. Oop. All right, Karen, if you're still there. Let's see. It looks like we lost Karen.
Well, while we're waiting for Karen to come up, if you have any other questions, let Megan know if you'd like to be acknowledged to speak, or if you want to put something either in the Q&A or the chat. We're trying to monitor both.
Yes, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to speak aloud and ask a specific question.
We'll give some time for those questions to come together, and we'll move on and hear from Ronnie, and that'll give us a little more time as well at the end. So Ronnie Grabon is going to talk a little bit about the big issue, really the kind of the elephant on the table that everybody's been asking about is what does accountability look like and what does equity look like? So Ronnie, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and then we'll get started.
Hi, I'm Ronnie Grabon. I've been involved as a consultant with JER-HR for a number of years, and I've been in the human resource field for many years before that. My primary occupation is as an executive coach. And when I've looked at these issues of DEI, it's something that's been interesting to me for many, many years. I recognize that what keeps me engaged with these issues personally is that I stay curious, and I have to stay very thoughtful and really think about where are we going with this? What do they mean? And how do we use DEI to improve social change, which is really what we're talking about. It's not just in the workplace, it's throughout the environment we live in. We started DEI with diversity and inclusion. And diversity and equity is really radically different than diversity and inclusion. When you think about equity, you really have to think about shifting power structures. So we're very used to doing top-down power structure, make a decision, and then maybe we get input. Maybe we get some input and then the senior management makes a decision. But when you deal with equity, you've got to really be listening at lower levels. You've got to really hear the people impacted. If they're not with you from the beginning, you're unlikely to have truly equitable outcomes. Diversity and inclusion often require equal input, but they don't require equal outcome. When you move into equity, and particularly if you move as far as justice, you really are moving into equal outcomes. It really requires reviewing all areas of the business. You've got to review your policies and practices. They may appear equal, the same amount of sick days for everybody, but they may end up having inequitable results. Jury duty, may look very equal. Everybody gets the same amount of time. But if you're African American or you're poorer or lower level employees are having more difficulty getting to the courthouse to do jury duty, what does that mean? And how does that affect your policy? So the outcome of what's necessary may affect what's happening, not just the input. And one of the most difficult things is we have to look at the external practices of the business. How does this impact the customer and the community? If I'm an African-American employee in an arts organization and I notice that the audiences are primarily white, what is that saying to me as an employee? What is that saying to our community? And do I just say, well, everybody can come, or do I do something different about how to understand, how do I attract different audiences? If I want to put my medical clinic in a given location, how do I understand how people, yes, everybody's equitable or equal, or they can all come if they want, but how does the location of my clinic affect who actually shows up? And I have to ask that question about all groups, women, minorities, and the differently abled. So it's a very complex conversation once I get on into the impact of the business itself. If we look at the next slide as to where DEI came from, we started out with EEO, and many of you may be old enough to remember when that first came, right, when we first started talking about that, affirmative action, harassment policies. But these are often very legalistic, bureaucratic, they're absolutely necessary, and they can be aimed at specific areas, aimed at diversity. Do we have the right number of diverse employees? Are people getting promoted? But they're often, again, not aimed at equitable outcomes. Employee resource groups are an excellent addition to any group. Lacy talked about that, and I'd like to ask him in a moment. He had some very good things to offer to answer to one of the questions, but they're often aimed at inclusion and safety for those people in the group. They're rarely aimed at really giving a voice to the issues of those groups, meaning aimed at equal outcomes. So do we hear the voices of that employee resource group at all levels so that it can affect the actual policy? So we want to go beyond harassment policies to impact all policies. How do our practices in hiring affect equity? We might say, well, we're looking for the same credentials. Everybody has to have a college degree, or everybody has to have a college degree or 5 years of experience, but maybe that's not enough. Maybe we have to go beyond. I have an example around that, as talking specifically about hiring, where I looked at people hiring for autistic individuals. And the company set up a strategy where they started the interview process with an Excel worksheet. If you want to work here and you want to work in a program aimed at autistic individuals, can you do the spreadsheet? They didn't need the interviewing skills, which autistic people are not as competent at often. But if they performed well at the spreadsheet, they got into the assessment center. And if they performed well in the assessment center, they were able to be hired on, even though their experience and credentials may not have matched the description of the job or the initial qualifications of the job. So those are some examples. In that particular case, that company is taking that group of autistic individuals and giving them more leniency and time off, recognizing that anxiety is a particular issue among those groups. Now that may seem unfair to other groups, and it may seem unequal. However, it is equitable for the groups involved. So those are just some examples of things you can do in different places. As we look at our last slide, for me, I say diversity seeks different people with the same credentials. Equity seeks different credentials. Diversity focuses on the same positions. Equity might focus on different positions. I had an example with a client recently that I found particularly instructive to me. I'm learning a lot in this process. So they had a senior team of 4 people. One of those 4 people, all of them white, 2 white women, 2 white men. One of the white women resigned. They decided to go a level down and create a senior team that had 6 people on it. So they recreated their structure. And by going down to include 6 people, they were able to include a level that included a number of diverse individuals rather than simply replacing one of the 4 people who resigned. I found that a really terrific example of watching how equity was incorporated into the workplace in their day-to-day living. I talked about hiring requirements already. What capabilities do I really need? Who can I include in my team? Equity really requires moving from top-down decision-making to co-design, making decisions together. And it's a very hard thing to do because, again, going back to my first point, you really have to shift your power structure in order to do that. So I'm open to questions.
So, Ronnie, I thought that particular point might really be instructional for Stacy's question, in which there was this program developed by a group of managers that were perceived as perhaps not in touch with the rest of the organization. It was not received very well. So how might they have approached that in a perhaps co-design method?
Mm-hmm. I think it helps to know what the program is, but as you think about it, are you able to get voices early on? And that's really hard because it means that you are saying to a group of employees, we're looking at pay structure, for instance, or we're looking at paid time off policies. And it can have the impact of potentially raising expectations where you don't want to do that. And yet, in order to really understand, you have to ask some questions. So for instance, the question of how do our current policies impact your days off? Or what do you use your days off for? If you find that your minorities or lower level employees are using their days off for fixing cars and attending to childcare and visiting schools, and you find your upper level or white employees are using their time to go to the beach, you may have some inequitable outcomes, even though the days off are the same. I don't have an answer for how specifically to address that, but if I start to understand that, I might start to think about then, what does my policy start to look like? Or how do I make a policy that helps address that? So it's really getting that input from the bottom, from the bottom up. Does that answer that?
Stacy, feel free to request to be unmuted if you'd like to ask specifically for some more clarity. I see she's continued to post, and she said that one of the questions really is the customer and the community impact equitable? So it's somewhat related to that. She says one of the unintended consequences of nonprofit service providers that cater to needy members of the Black and brown community is that they start to act like customer community is inherently faulty or a composite of needs, addictions, and mental deficiencies. On the other side of the coin is the way nonprofit service providers treat donors. The community sees all of that. And so what are your thoughts around that dichotomy?
I think that's a really hard one. And yet, again, I'm thinking about some 2 nonprofits that I've been involved with. There's been some conversation around adaptive philanthropy. I am not a fundraiser. I don't understand that, but I would begin to research some of that. I've heard people speak about how are we bringing our Black and brown donors into the conversation? Even if they can give $1 or $2, they may be even more important to the conversation than the white donor who can give $10,000. And are we bringing that person in? How are we incorporating that? Immigrant communities going way back used to do things among themselves. So I remember my Jewish great-grandfather managed a small cemetery burial system where people would throw in $1 each so that they could bury the next person who died, right? This was a way of having the community support the community. I don't know how that adapts. Again, I'm not a fundraiser, but how do you adapt that kind of thing, and who knows about that? And are you researching that, and are you looking at that material to see?
Well, there certainly does seem to be a lot of focus on micro donors from the standpoint of even small loans given to individuals who could start a small business. And, you know, even Obama's political campaign was known early on for the number of small donations they were set up to take, so that instead of going after mega donors all the time, you get more buy-in across the community by going up a lot of small donors who can afford to contribute. So it sounds like that's the kind of thing you may be talking about as well, Ronnie.
Well, that's right. And I'm not a fundraiser. I don't know how that works, but to get into that conversation. And the same thing, to get into the conversation, I've been talking to another nonprofit around housing, and they've been doing a lot to respond to the needs of the housing community, the needs of people who need help in the housing community. They're beginning to think about moving more toward advocacy, that organization, and policy change, because they recognize they're not really changing the causes. And how does not changing the cause affect my internals, right? This is essentially an HR session we're doing here, but how does it affect my internals? I have to recognize that my external population, stakeholders, my internals may be part of my externals. They work together. I can't just look at one group and say, okay, we're just going to talk about, do we have enough diverse people at the top, without talking about how do the policies our company or our organization has with the community affect the people inside as well. I think Lacy had a very good comment that, Lacy, you might want to repeat around corporate culture.
Lacy, would you like to speak to that?
Well, I was thinking about a couple of different avenues in terms of how do you address that. And one thing that I would like to say is look at, and I think Stacy picked up on this, there are some non-traditional ways in which you could look at your donors, look at your funding. And that is, I'll give you an example. Each year, our organization participates in United Way's efforts, but there are various components, and there are some nonprofits. There's some organizations within the umbrella of United Way that employees say, that's important to us. We need to support that. And so our dollars, our contributions go toward that effort. So it's being able to see, well, where's the funding sources coming from? Others that may be in the midst of non-traditional communities, look at your faith base. That's one way of looking at how they manage financially, and could they partner in said efforts. So it's looking at some new and creative approaches in terms of how do you get your funding, or where there's some other efforts taking place in the community. Did I answer?
I see we have two questions in Q&A. One says, how can we bring the equity conversation up with our organization? Who should we start the conversation with? And Liz, we'll get to yours next.
I think that's a great comment. Before I go there, Sandie, I did specifically want to respond. I think it's Jacqueline, but I can't see all the comments, who mentions being careful to assume that minority donors are small donors.
Yes.
I did not intend in any way to make that assumption. My comments were really targeted at making sure we're not ignoring small donors.
Good. I'm glad you spoke to that, because I saw that comment as well.
Yeah, so I apologize if that came off in the wrong way.
And she also put in chat a good link to a white paper called The Operational Donor. So that may be helpful.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline. I appreciate that. And some people, that comment about how can we bring the equity conversation up in our organization, I think it's exactly starting with the conversation we're just having now. I said something that may not have sounded right. Jacqueline was brave enough, and I appreciate that, to say, wait a minute, did you really mean it to say that? And that ability to begin to create an organizational culture that allows conversation, that acknowledges it and doesn't shut it down because you may have hurt somebody's feelings, or doesn't walk away from the conversation because you're afraid of hurting somebody's feelings. That ability to speak openly and say, we're an all-white organization, 95%, our community is 95% white. What do you guys care about? What could we do? What are you seeing? What are you seeing in the community that we may not be seeing? And that's a very, very rich conversation to have, and an excellent way to start the conversation.
Liz's question is, your organization, if your organization doesn't have a DE&I strategy, what's the best way to bring it up? Start with your HR department. If you are a smaller organization without an HR department, what's the best way to raise the topic? Additionally, what are the best resources to share with leaders to demonstrate the importance of DE&I?
Would you like me to take that, Sandie, or somebody else?
Yeah, that would be great.
I mean, I'll start there. I'm an HR person from way back, and yet there's part of me that wants to say it's great if you don't have an HR person. That's almost better, because otherwise you tend to throw it off to the HR people and hope they'll go over to the side and handle it all by themselves, and with luck, you know, bring forward some program that nobody will pay attention to. You want it embedded at all levels of the organization. The diversity committee that works on the diversity policy and the diversity strategy separately from the rest of the world is not the committee you really want to be operating with. You want to have policy, DEI policies built into the boardroom, into your marketing department, into your compensation areas, into your hiring areas, into your management structure. And that's really why we want to, where we want to start. Get curious. You know, what does it mean to care about this issue? And what does it mean in your community to care about this issue?
We still have a little time. Renee, Lacy, would you like to speak to any of these questions or comments?
Sure, I'll go ahead and then piggyback on what Ronnie said. I always start with a value proposal. What it says is, as an organization, we care about not only our community that we're operating from, but also internally, we care about our employees. And because of that, this is a priority, and this is important to us. And we value your presence and your contributions. So that being said, that is always, and it could start with a small group of employees, but ultimately it gets to your senior managers as a support to say, it's one thing when it's a suggestion, it's another thing when it becomes a mandate. This will take place, this will happen, we will expand and get out of our comfort zone, and we'll begin to see. That also helps them in terms of moving the needle when they're within the corporate community to say, hey, we don't want to get behind. Remember, one of the things that I said is that diverse organizations have a 35% advantage competitively. I don't know of any organization that wants to be disadvantaged or left behind or isn't competitive to some extent or some degree. And it also speaks to the relevance of that organization.
I think the other thing that I'd add, and there may be other comments, is somebody said this to me once about people with disabilities in the school system. They said, you know, we're all disabled. We are all diverse. Until we see it in all of us and understand that this is something that we all need to deal with. I will never forget my operations manager putting in a brand new hand washing pump in the bathroom and discovering that it was too long for somebody who only had one arm, and we needed to change the pump. All right. I mean, of all the silly things, and yet this was one individual, and that his disability, the thing that caused him pain, was different than others, and we didn't know. And until you hear it, you don't know what to do. You've got to be able to have a culture that listens, and that's the only way you're going to get at it.
I'd like to applaud our doodler, Ashton, who's been doing a doodle or a mind map for us as we've been talking. I know that he's been doing that for all of the sessions. And I think when we talk about diversity, this is diversity of learning style and how you take in information. So I think it's great that he's been doing these doodles, and we've got one now on our panel that'll be very fun and very interesting to follow up with. Megan, someone's asked to have it posted again in chat, the link to the operational donor. If you can make sure that gets shared with everybody, that would be great.
For sure. I actually don't see the link any. Aha. Here we go.
Good. You found it. All right.
Mhm.
We've got just a few minutes left. Any other questions or comments before we go away? If you're interested in diversity of thought and mindset, stay for our 3 o'clock session with our affiliate Ken Katzeff, who is going to talk about a wonderful tool to allow you to get some idea of mindset diversity and ways of thinking. And we actually will be able to give anyone who attends that access to a free assessment. So that's the 3 o'clock session on Agile EQ and diversity of mindset. Any last passing comments from Lacy?
Sandie.
All right, so it's time for us to move on, I think. Ronnie, Lacy, any last parting comments?
No, thank you all so much.
Thank you, and thank you everybody
Thank
for
you, everyone.
attending. Bye-bye.
Bye.